You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. Agents are a somewhat newer addition to the AI tech industry, so in this episode, I'll explain what they are and how they are different from regular RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation application architecture. Then, naming things is hard, and there are plenty of jokes about developers being terrible at naming things. I'll highlight a common theme I've noticed specifically with presentation titles and exploring considerations for better naming. The first topic up today is Retrieval Augmented Generation, or RAG, versus agents. If you recall a previous episode where we've talked about RAG architecture, the process is that a user sends a request, often a question or term or topic. You search an external data source for relevant information. Then it returns the original request and the relevant context to the LLM, and then the LLM generates a response. The difference with agents is that there are multiple potential tools that retrieve relevant information. The LLM is going to choose which tool will most likely provide the best response, and that's going to be based on some tool definitions that you can set up, and then it will call that tool to provide the response. There's a couple of articles actually that added some additional color to my original thoughts. I was thinking that agents really only differ in the architecture, and that there's multiple tools, a list of tools, rather than a single data source that's being called, and then the LLM is just going to decide which data source to use. But the articles pointed out that there's some other factors involved in agentic workflows or agentic architecture. Let's take an example really quickly. First is that an employee maybe has a question about their internal workplace. Then the LLM in an agentic system could determine whether to route to IT technical documentation or run a payroll database query to return the relevant results, or create an HR help desk ticket for them to get help directly through HR, or send them to an employee portal website with some instructions on how to do that self-service function that they're looking to do. So there's a variety of options here, and each one of those is going to be very different and include different types of return data and information that's going to be provided. Agents are going to increase the complexity of your applications, at least potentially, because now you're dealing with multiple tools that you have to maintain, you have to define, you have to test and evaluate those responses. But those systems are also going to be more dynamic and interactive. RAG is going to be more static because it's only accessing specific information, a single data source that you've set up. So it's going to be less flexible for questions or requests that are outside of those realms. So if somebody asks a question that's not related to, let's say, IT technical documentation, you're going to have a default response, or the LLM's going to say, I don't know how to answer that, or something. But in an agentic workflow, you could potentially have a tool or a data source that would be able to respond to those requests. There's also a little bit more room for the AI to be more interactive and make more complex decisions. So not only could it call a single tool, it could complete a series of steps. First, I go route to IT technical documentation. Then I need to do this thing for the user. Then I need to help them here. Then I need to provide this back, or ask a clarifying question or something like that. It's going to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more dynamic. There could be potentially multiple steps and processes for these decisions and functionality that the LLM needs to handle. There also might be some slightly different terminology when you're looking at implementing this, depending on your framework and your tooling community that you're working within. As an example, you'll hear agents or agentic workflows or tools or terms like this used in especially the Python community. For instance, LangChain uses that term. However, if you look at a library like Spring AI, they consider this kind of general process structure as function calling, because the LLM makes a decision which function to complete or which backend API to call. They term it as function calling. I see this as very similar here. It's just that LangChain and others use agents or agentic workflows, and then Spring AI and probably others use function calling as the term. These look like the same thing, or at least they overlap enough. So this is the difference between RAG and agents. There's a little bit of an architecture difference in just the number of tools being called, but also the complexity and the flexibility that agents are going to provide. I will link the articles that I read in the show notes as well if you want to take a look at that. Really excellent articles, one being very short overview, and then one being a little bit more in depth and talking about more in-depth topics of pros and cons and what all is involved with agents versus RAG. The next piece I wanted to talk just a little bit about is naming things. There's no specific article I wanted to link to here, but it's just a theme that I've noticed over this year that a lot of sessions and abstracts will use specific technologies or project names in the title. First of all, just as a level setter, this is a really good reminder for myself as well, not just others. I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but it's very easy to slide into jargon or technical terms that you're used to or that you use every day. But remember that these are not always translatable to broader audiences. Let's take an example of this. Let's say we have a session titled How to Use Neo4j for Better Performance. First of all, what if you're looking at someone who doesn't know what Neo4j is? Is it a tool? Is it a programming language? Is it a database? Is it a architecture structure, or who knows? Then what kind of better performance? What kind of problem is it solving? Are we talking applications? Are we talking security? Are we talking something different? This title is too generic and potentially unknown if someone isn't interested in learning something completely new. For instance, if I'm just curious or want to add a new term to my repertoire, then I might still attend it. But for me personally, if I looked at a session title and had no idea what it was going to cover or what things I would learn or what things I would be able to apply in my daily work, I would be much less likely to attend. It's more risk to the attendee that it won't be what they anticipated or that it won't be relevant or helpful to them because there's too many unknowns in that title. First off, for me and anyone else looking at naming specifically abstracts or titles of things, think about your audience. Are you looking to pull in new people? Are you talking to new audiences? Do they need to know what it is that you're talking about? Or maybe you're speaking to existing developers on a specific topic within that tech. That might be okay to be a little bit more specific and use project names if you're talking to an audience that you know already has that base level knowledge. However, if you're dealing with a mixed audience too, some people who know, some people who don't, it's okay to list those technologies, especially I think in the abstract itself, so in the paragraph description of that. But I still would lean towards more generic and general terms that explain what is going to be learned or the problem being solved when you're looking at the title. For instance, let's take our original title of How to Use Neo4j for Better Performance. Let's improve that one step and say how to use graph databases for better performance. Now, as someone potentially new, I would look at that and say, oh, it's a new type of database. Maybe I'm familiar with relational or document databases. This is a graph database. This is something new. Maybe my colleagues have been talking to me about learning this, or maybe my department wants to look at graph databases as a potential solution. This might be something that's a little bit more relevant and a little bit more helpful to me as an attendee evaluating whether this is going to be worthwhile or not. But I could still improve better performance. That could still mean a lot of things, right? It could mean applications, it could mean queries, it could mean request routing, it could be architecture. Really specify who is the audience you're talking to, what kinds of things are you wanting them to learn, what kinds of things should they be getting out of that, so that someone who reads the abstract says, this is super relevant to me and I want to attend this, or this really isn't in my topic category. Maybe I'll catch the recording, or maybe it's not for me. Not only does this apply to naming sessions or titling anything, this also applies to naming variables, tech packages, projects, and so much more. So keep this in mind. Try to stick to more general terms, general problems and concepts, at least in the title. And then if you want to call out specific technologies you're going to use when you do the description, by all means, I think that is very helpful. Wrapping up, agentic workflows are different from RAG in that the LLM is going to decide which tool in a defined set is likely to provide the best answer. While the process is going to be the same between agents and RAG, agents are going to open up a little bit more dynamic and interactive AI. Then I explored ways for me to improve presentation names in the future by sticking to problems and general concepts. I hope this was helpful to you. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.